For years, she moved like a ghost in her own home, setting dinner for two, eating alone, sleeping beside a man who didn't even notice when her heart stopped reaching for him. But when the day finally came, the day she whispered the word divorce, he didn't react with sadness. He reacted with panic, because the woman he thought would always stay was already gone long before she ever walked out the door. If you've ever loved someone so deeply that you slowly lost yourself, this story will feel painfully familiar. Stay with me. When Maya Thompson rolled over at dawn, her hand met nothing but cold sheets again. The chill startled her a little, the way a forgotten truth sometimes did, sliding back into the mind before a person was fully awake. She blinked toward the faint morning light leaking around the curtains, and for a moment she lay perfectly still, listening. The condo held its usual silence, deep and impersonal, the kind of quiet that didn't come from peace but from absence. Ethan wasn't home. He hadn't been home long enough to warm the bed beside her in months. She pushed herself upright and pulled the blanket around her shoulders, pausing when she saw the other half of the bed. His pillow looked barely touched, the fabric smooth, the indentation shallow, as if a guest had slept there, as if she lived with a man who didn't need rest, or didn't need her. She reached out and pressed her fingertips to the cotton, hoping to feel the faintest remaining warmth, but it was cold all the way through. The digital clock on the nightstand read 6:03 a.m. Maya rubbed her eyes, feeling the faint sting from another night of fractured sleep. She used to sleep deeply, curled against Ethan's chest, lulled by the steady rhythm of his breathing. Now her nights were a restless loop of turning over, checking the time, and wondering why she was still trying. She slid out of bed and tightened her robe around her waist. Her feet touched the hardwood floor, cool, smooth, too clean. The condo felt like a showroom more than a home, full of Ethan's expensive choices: Italian leather, stone countertops, glossy artwork she never connected with. He had built their life upward, always upward, as if height could fill the emotional void forming between them. The view from the 22nd floor was stunning. The loneliness was unbearable. Maya stepped into the kitchen and hit the button on the coffee maker. The machine purred softly, filling the room with a faint aroma that somehow made the emptiness more obvious. She leaned against the counter while it brewed, staring at the stainless steel appliances, all gleaming and untouched. She remembered when they used to cook together pasta on the stove, a bottle of cheap wine open, music humming in the background. They used to laugh over burnt garlic or too salty sauce. These days, the kitchen didn't see anything but takeout containers and quiet. Her phone buzzed on the counter, screen lighting up with a single unread message: Ethan, sent at 4:52 a.m., early meeting, back late, no greeting, no goodbye, no, I'll miss you, just a small string of words, sterile as a receipt. Maya stared at the message until the screen dimmed again. She swallowed and felt her throat ache from the familiar disappointment. She shouldn't expect more. She didn't know when she'd lowered the bar so far that a simple love you now felt unrealistic, like asking for too much. She poured her coffee and carried it to the small breakfast table by the window. Portland was just waking up, the sky a soft gray, the river reflecting patches of pale orange. She held the mug in both hands, letting the heat seep into her palms, grounding her for a moment. Her body felt heavy, her heart even heavier. She wondered when she had stopped hoping he'd be home in the morning. When had she accepted these quiet dawns as normal? When had she stopped reaching for him in the night because she already knew he wouldn't be there? It was strange how people adjusted to deprivation, slowly, quietly, without meaning to. Emotional crumbs had become her daily bread, and somehow she had convinced herself she shouldn't complain. She was 39, old enough to know that love required presence, not promises. Old enough to know that marriages didn't suddenly shatter, they eroded, bit by bit, through neglect and silence. She took a sip of coffee and closed her eyes. A faint ringing started at the back of her mind, that familiar whisper. This isn't enough. You deserve more. It wasn't anger, not anymore. just the dull recognition of a truth she'd tried to avoid. When she finished her coffee, she stood and carried the mug to the sink. The microwave door caught her reflection unexpectedly, a blurred image on the dark glass. She stopped, leaned closer. The woman looking back at her had tired eyes, faint lines around her mouth from nights spent biting back words she wanted to say. She looked older than she remembered, not older in years, but older in spirit, a woman carrying too much silence. She lifted her hand and touched her cheek lightly, as if testing whether the reflection belonged to her or some stranger living in this spotless, echoing condo. It startled her, the way she didn't immediately recognize herself. She had once been full of warmth, softness, light. Now she looked like a shadow standing in someone else's kitchen. Her breath caught in her throat, the moment sinking into her chest like a stone. She wondered, almost fearfully, how long she had been disappearing without noticing, how long she had lived next to a man who didn't seem to see her fading. The condo remained still, offering no comfort, no answer, only the steady hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic far below. Maya's hand dropped away from her face. A strange, hollow awareness spread through her ribs. Maybe this was the morning something finally cracked. Maybe this cold, empty dawn was the beginning of a truth she could no longer avoid. Maybe the real question wasn't why Ethan kept leaving. Maybe the real question was why she kept staying. She stood alone in the quiet kitchen, heart beating slow and heavy, and wondered what finally pushes a woman to admit she is alone inside her own marriage. There was a time when Ethan's laughter filled every room they walked into. Maya remembered it with a softness that ached, the sound of it bright and round, the kind of laugh that made strangers smile even if they didn't know the joke. That memory drifted through her mind later that morning as she folded a blanket at the foot of the couch, her hands moving slowly as if touching fabric might carry her backward in time. It had been 10 years ago, at a small community fundraiser in a converted barn on the outskirts of Portland. The place smelled of cedar and mulled cider, and string lights were draped along the rafters like captured stars. Maya had gone because her coworker couldn't stop talking about the local artists whose work would be auctioned. She had expected an ordinary evening, maybe a quiet meal from the food truck parked outside. What she didn't expect was a man spilling half a cup of cider on her shoes in the first 5 minutes. "I am so sorry," he'd said, flustered, grabbing napkins from the concession table. "I swear I'm usually more coordinated than this." She doubted it, considering he almost stepped on the napkins he just grabbed. But his earnestness made her laugh. Maya remembered seeing something unguarded in his eyes, a warmth she felt in her chest before she could explain why. They ended up standing beside each other during the charity auction, whispering jokes about the bidding wars, and later walked out together to the gravel lot lit by a single crooked lamp. Dinner, he'd asked, shoving his hands in his jacket pockets as if bracing for rejection. "Depends," she'd replied, half teasing. "You planning on spilling anything else on me?" His laugh echoed against the barn walls. 1 hour later, they were sitting on a curb outside a tiny taco truck, sharing a plate of $5 carnitas. Maya hadn't tasted anything so good since college. Ethan kept leaning back to look at her, as if memorizing her face in the orange glow of the truck lights. They talked about everything and nothing, how she grew up in Eastern Oregon with parents who valued quiet over conversation, how he was raised in a loud Californian family that argued like sport but loved fiercely. He told her about his first computer, how he'd taken it apart at age 12 and nearly electrocuted himself putting it back together. She told him she wanted someday to see the Grand Canyon, not through a plane window, but standing at the edge, feeling small in the best way. What she remembered most wasn't what they said. It was the feeling that she could breathe easier around him, like laughing wasn't something she had to earn. Their early years were built on small joys. Movie nights curled under a thrift store blanket, long walks on the Springwater Trail, sometimes talking, sometimes not, comfortable in the silence. On weekends, they drove into the Columbia River Gorge, hiking miles uphill with cheap sandwiches in their packs. Ethan always carried 2 extra bottles of water, just in case, and she teased him for being dramatic. At night, They lay on the hood of his old Subaru, counting meteors as if the sky belonged to them. One summer evening, they danced barefoot on the wooden patio behind Maya's apartment. A neighbor had hung string lights across the yard, glowing like soft lanterns, and the music from someone's radio drifted into the dusk. Ethan twirled her clumsily, and she laughed so hard she nearly lost her balance. He caught her by the waist, held her close, forehead touching hers. "This feels like home," he'd whispered, barely audible. She remembered how her heart had stilled, how she'd realized that this moment, this man was what she wanted to build her life around. Not extravagance, not success, just presence, shared air, hands that held her steady. As Maya rinsed her coffee mug in the sink now, the memory pressed hard against her ribs. She could almost hear the music again, almost feel the warmth of his hand at the small of her back. But the kitchen around her was immaculate, untouched, silent. The kind of silence that didn't belong to love, but to distance. She walked to the living room and opened the curtains. Outside, the river shimmered beneath the pale morning sky. She remembered standing here years ago with Ethan beside her, pointing out the boats, planning trips they never took. Back then, he used to slip his arm around her waist without thinking. She tried to recall the last time he touched her like that. Weeks, months longer. A tight breath left her chest, one she didn't realize she was holding. The weight of nostalgia settled over her warm at first, then painfully sharp. She didn't just miss the man Ethan used to be. She missed the version of herself who believed she deserved that kind of attention. The realization rose slowly, like a tide creeping over her feet. She was no longer the woman who danced barefoot under string lights. She had become someone who tiptoed around her own home, careful not to expect too much. Her stomach tightened, and she pressed a hand there, grounding herself. It frightened her, how far she had drifted from the life she once dreamed of, how far she had drifted from the woman she once was. As she stood at the window, her reflection faintly visible in the glass, she saw herself smile an involuntary, wistful smile when a memory of Ethan's clumsy dance flickered in her mind. But the smile faded almost instantly, leaving behind the hollow echo of years she couldn't get back. How long had it been since she'd smiled like that? Really smiled. The answer slipped through her like cold water. Too long, far too long. And that thought, sharp, undeniable, left her with a question she wasn't ready to face. How did a love so warm turn so cold? The first crack was small enough that Maya ignored it. It came on a Thursday evening in late spring, one of those soft Portland nights when the air smelled faintly of rain, even if the sky stayed clear. She'd made pasta because it used to be Ethan's favorite, and she lit a single candle in the center of the table, something she hadn't done in a while, though she wasn't sure why. Maybe she'd hoped he would notice. Maybe she'd hoped she could pull them back into a moment that once came easily. But 7 o'clock passed, then 7:15, and by 7:30, the candle had burned almost halfway down, its flame shrinking into a narrow glow. Maya sat at the table, twirling a fork in her hand, telling herself he was stuck in traffic or wrapping up a meeting. He'd text. He always texted, except this time, he didn't. When he finally walked through the door at 8:14, his face lit by the glow of his phone, he gave her a distracted kiss on the cheek. He glanced at the candle, the plates, the cooling pasta. "Sorry, long day," he said, already loosening his tie. "I grabbed something on the way home." That was the first crack. Small, easy to overlook. She blew out the candle before it collapsed into wax entirely. In the weeks that followed, Ethan's company grew at a pace neither of them could have predicted. Investors called at all hours. His team sent messages long after midnight. The office became his second home, and sometimes Maya feared it had become his first. He came home with the kind of exhaustion that made conversation feel like an inconvenience. She'd ask about his day, and he'd respond with vague phrases, busy but good, or same stuff, different meeting. She tried to share things from her own day, but his eyes would drift to his phone or the muted TV, and the words would tangle in her throat. She wasn't sure when he began sleeping on the very edge of the bed, but she remembered the first night she noticed. She had reached out to rest her hand on his back, something she used to do without thinking. He didn't move away, but he didn't respond either. His breathing stayed steady, untouched by her presence. Another crack, thin but sharp. Over time, late nights became the norm. She ate alone so often she stopped setting the table for two. Instead, she left his plate covered with foil on the stove, though most nights he never touched it. He'd walk through the door sometime near midnight, mumbling a tired apology before heading straight to the shower. She tried asking him lightly at first if they could plan a weekend away, maybe head to the coast like they used to. Ethan smiled, distracted. "Let's check the calendar," he said. The calendar, she learned, was a place where her requests went to die. One evening, when the sky outside their windows was turning a deep blue, Maya reheated leftovers and set a plate on the counter for herself. She sat on one of the bar stools, her bare feet dangling, and listened to Ethan take another call in the living room. His voice carried just enough for her to catch pieces of the conversation. "No, she's fine," he said, his tone brisk. "She understands." She always does. Something inside her went very still. She's fine. As if her feelings were a box he placed neatly on a shelf, labeled and forgotten. As if her absence from his life would be nothing more than a slight adjustment. She froze with her fork halfway to her mouth, feeling the words settle in her chest like heavy sand. She didn't know whether to be angry or sad. Mostly, she felt small. That night, she lay awake staring at the faint glow of the street lamp sliding across the ceiling. Ethan was snoring softly beside her, unaware she'd stayed up long after he fell asleep. Her thoughts circled slowly. Was she being needy? Was she expecting too much? Or was he slipping away in increments so small she hadn't realized he was already gone? The next morning, she tried to talk to him before he left. "Ethan," she began, tying her robe tighter around her. "Do you think we could have dinner together tonight? Just us?" He kissed her forehead. "I'll try," he said, already reaching for his keys. Big week, you know how it is. But she didn't know anymore. She didn't know how his world worked because he never let her into it. She watched him leave, listened to the click of the closing door, and felt something tremble under her ribs. By the following month, the pattern had settled into something that didn't even feel like a pattern, more like a permanent state. Missed dinners blurred together. Texts became shorter. Conversations evaporated. She still tried, here and there, asked small questions, made small suggestions, but everything she offered seemed to disappear into a void, unanswered. One Thursday evening, she lit a candle again, not for romance, just for atmosphere, to make herself feel less alone. The flame flickered across the plates she'd arranged carefully, out of habit more than hope. It burned down slowly, shrinking into a tiny glowing knot at the base while she sat there, waiting without letting herself admit she was waiting. By 9 o'clock, she finally rose from the table, carrying her plate to the sink. She glanced back at the candle burned all the way to the wick, the last bit of flame curling into smoke. She stood there, hands braced on the counter, trying to breathe through the quiet disappointment settling into her chest. She told herself relationships had seasons. She told herself work came in waves. She told herself that marriages survived more than this. But as she turned off the kitchen light, one thought slid uninvited into her mind, colder than the tile floor beneath her feet. When did patience become self-abandonment? The question lingered long after she walked down the hall, and it didn't loosen its grip, even when she tried to shut it out. She carried hope in a small lunchbox and walked out carrying humiliation instead. The morning had started with a softness she hadn't felt in months. Maya stood in the warm light of the kitchen, making Ethan's favorite chicken salad sandwich, slicing apples the way he liked with the peel on, thin and crisp. There was something almost tender in the way she packed it all neatly, tucking a note beside the napkin before she could second-guess herself. "Thought you might need a break today?" She signed it with a small heart she hadn't drawn in years. It felt foolish and earnest at the same time, but she held on to the version of herself who used to do these little things without worrying whether they made her look needy. It was a cool Friday, the early autumn air brushing her arms as she stepped out of the condo. The lunchbox sat on the passenger seat, bright and hopeful against the dark leather. She tried not to imagine Ethan's face lighting up, tried not to imagine that this gesture might pull them back toward each other. The drive to his office took 15 minutes, long enough for nerves to settle in her stomach. She hadn't visited his workplace in almost a year, not since things began drifting. The tech campus rose like a glass and steel kingdom, its reflective panels catching the gray Portland sky. She parked near the visitor entrance, tightening her grip on the handle of the lunchbox as she stepped out. Inside, the lobby felt colder than she remembered, sleek, modern, busy. Young employees in hoodies and badges walked quickly, eyes glued to screens. She felt like an artifact from another life, standing there in her soft sweater and jeans. But she straightened her shoulders and approached the front desk. "I'm here to see Ethan Carter," she said, offering a polite smile. The receptionist tapped a few keys, then nodded her toward the elevators. "Take it to the 3rd floor. Ma'am, someone will assist you." When she stepped out into Ethan's hallway, she could already hear the low hum of voices behind closed doors. His assistant, Laura, a woman in her early 30s with sharp bangs and sharper eyes, stood from her desk as soon as she saw Maya approaching. "Oh," Laura said, her expression flickering into something that looked like embarrassment. "Mrs. Carter, I wasn't expecting you." Maya held up the lunchbox, her smile hopeful, but not overly so. "I thought I'd surprise him." There was a pause long enough to bruise. Laura smoothed her blouse, eyes darting toward Ethan's office door. "He's in meetings all day, back to back. I'm afraid he won't be available." "It's just lunch," Maya said gently. "I can wait a few minutes." Another pause. This time, heavier. "He really can't step out," Laura whispered. "Maybe next week I can put you on his calendar." The words landed like a slap. Put you on his calendar, as if she were a vendor, a client. Someone who required scheduling instead of someone he once couldn't stop touching, couldn't stop talking to. But Maya just nodded, swallowing around the tightness in her throat. "Of course. I understand." "I'm sorry," Laura added quietly. And for a moment, Maya believed she truly was. Maya turned away, feeling heat crawl up her neck. She walked back toward the elevator, her footsteps too loud in the sterile hallway. The lunchbox swung gently at her side, light as ever, but suddenly unbearably heavy. In the polished glass beside the elevator doors, her reflection appeared small, uncertain, out of place among the confident faces rushing past her. She pressed the button and waited. Each passing second stretched thin, her breath catching in that space between disappointment and shame. The elevator arrived with a soft chime. The moment the doors closed around her, she finally allowed her shoulders to sag. By the time she reached the parking lot, the lunchbox felt like a joke she'd told badly. She didn't know why the sting was so sharp, why it felt like rejection. Not of the lunch, but of her. Maybe it was because she'd let herself hope. Maybe it was because this was the first time in months she'd reached out with something tender, something honest. And he hadn't even known she'd tried. She unlocked the car, climbed inside, and set the lunchbox on her lap. The apples inside were still crisp, the sandwich still neatly wrapped. She touched the edge of the note she'd folded carefully earlier that morning, and something inside her cracked not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet collapse, like a beam giving way in an old house. She leaned back against the seat, eyes closing. A single tear slipped down her cheek, falling onto her jeans. Then another. She didn't sob, she didn't even make a sound. The grief moved through her silently, like a tide filling a low shoreline. She covered her mouth with her hand, as if keeping the sadness contained might make it smaller. But it wasn't small. It wasn't small at all. After a long moment, she wiped her eyes, took a shaky breath, and looked out at the shimmering glass building where Ethan worked, towering, impressive, and utterly indifferent to the woman sitting alone in the parking lot. She wondered, not for the first time, when she had become an afterthought, when her presence stopped being something he reached for, when the life they built with tacos and cheap wine had shifted into something polished and distant. She placed the lunchbox on the passenger seat again and stared at it until her vision blurred. The humiliation still pulsed under her skin, but beneath it, another feeling stirred quieter, deeper, harder to name. Was this the moment she stopped fighting for the marriage? The question settled into her chest with a heaviness she wasn't ready to face. Not yet. But it was there, waiting for her. Some endings didn't explode, they whispered. Maya learned that in the stillness of a Tuesday night, lying beside Ethan as he snored softly, oblivious to the woman staring up at the ceiling inches away from him. The room was dark except for a thin stripe of streetlight slipping through the blinds, brushing across their king-size bed like a reminder of how much space lay between them. She listened to the steady rhythm of his breathing, a sound that once comforted her. Now it pressed against her chest like a weight. She rolled onto her side, studying the outline of his shoulders under the duvet. He used to turn toward her in his sleep, searching for her warmth even before he woke. Now his back remained firmly toward her, night after night, as if his body had memorized the distance long before her heart had. The disappointment settled over her like a blanket she no longer tried to push off. It wasn't about the missed lunches or the canceled dinners. It wasn't even about the forgotten anniversaries. It was the accumulation of years' quiet hurts stacked like layers of sediment, forming something heavy and immovable. She let her eyes close, hoping for rest. But her mind kept tracing all the moments she had swallowed instead of spoken, the nights she had waited for him at the window, watching headlights sweep across the street, whispering to herself that he'd be home soon. The birthdays where she'd lit her own candle because he'd been stuck at one last meeting. The ache of sitting opposite him at dinner while he nodded absently at his phone, offering only fragments of attention. Tonight, the silence between them felt final. Maya exhaled slowly, then slipped out of bed, careful not to disturb him. Her feet touched the cool hardwood, and she wrapped her cardigan around her shoulders, padding softly down the hallway. The condo felt cavernous at night, modern, expensive, soulless, all surfaces, no warmth. She walked into the dining area, the city lights throwing long shadows across the table. It was almost the kind of hour when truth stopped hiding. She pulled out a chair and sat down, her fingers lingering on the smooth wood as if grounding herself. For a long moment, she just breathed, staring at the dark window where her reflection hovered faintly tired eyes, hair tangled from tossing and turning. A woman who had tried her best until there was no best left to give. Then she reached for her laptop. The screen glowed to life, illuminating her face with a pale blue wash. Her cursor hovered for several seconds before she typed two words she never imagined she'd type: Oregon divorce forms. The search results appeared with a bluntness that startled her. No ceremony, no softness, just instructions, checkboxes, legal language. She opened the first link. Her hands didn't shake the way she expected. She filled in her name, her address, the date of their marriage. She paused at the section titled Reason for Divorce, the blinking cursor waiting. There were options: irreconcilable differences, separation, incompatibility. None of them captured it. She typed emotional abandonment, then deleted it. Too dramatic, she thought, too raw. Instead, she chose the standard option: simple, vague, unremarkable, much like their marriage had become. She printed the forms, the machine in the corner coming to life with a soft hum. In the dim room, the printer's small green light glowed like a quiet beacon, casting a circle of illumination on the hardwood floor. The smell of warm paper drifted through the air. She stood, walked over, and took the pages as they slid out still warm against her fingertips. She carried them back to the dining table and sat again. The house felt impossibly silent, the kind of silence that swallowed sound, thought, memory. Taking a pen, she rested the tip above the signature line. Her breath caught not from hesitation, but from something else, Something unexpected. Relief. It washed over her in a slow, steady tide, gentle but undeniable. Grief clung to its edges, but beneath it was an unfamiliar ease, as if her body finally understood she didn't have to keep running after someone who never turned around. She signed her name. Her handwriting was steady, more steady than she'd imagined. The pen glided across the paper, leaving behind a trail that marked both an ending and a beginning. When she set it down, her chest felt strangely light. She leaned back, staring at the signed forms under the soft glow of the overhead light. She wondered if Ethan would even notice she'd left the bed, wondered if he'd realize she was gone before she packed her things, wondered if he'd care. The thought lodged itself in her heart like a thorn. She gathered the papers, placed them neatly into a manila folder, and closed it slowly, as though sealing something sacred. Standing up, she took one last glance around the room, the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the faint ticking of the thermostat, the vast emptiness of a home built by two people who no longer lived the same life. When she returned to the bedroom, Ethan hadn't moved. His back was still turned, his breathing still deep. She slid under the covers, careful not to brush against him. She stared at the ceiling. The whisper of an ending echoed inside her, and beneath it. The question she was afraid to ask, would he even care when she left? He didn't notice her walk into the room, but he noticed the envelope. Ethan's office sat under a wash of late evening light, warm against the dark wood, but utterly at odds with the tension in the air. He stood behind his desk, Bluetooth headset in place, pacing slightly as he talked numbers in a clipped, efficient tone that sounded nothing like the man Maya once knew. Yes, move the projection to Q3 and tell Rob I need the updated model by hang on. He glanced up just long enough to gesture at her to wait, tapping the speakerphone with quick fingers. His eyes returned to the screen, already swallowed by whatever deal he was trying to close. Maya stepped closer, her heartbeat steady in a way she didn't expect. It was as if she had crossed a threshold the night before, one that couldn't be uncrossed. She held the manila envelope against her chest for a brief moment, feeling the sharp corners through the thin paper. Then, without a word, she set it down on top of the spreadsheets scattered across his desk. Ethan didn't even look, just nodded vaguely toward the papers, muttering something about just a second. His voice had that distracted cadence he used whenever life tried to pull him away from the empire he was building. But the envelope stayed there, a quiet intruder in his kingdom of graphs and quarterly targets. Maya stepped back, not far, just enough to watch. No, the rollout can't wait, Ethan said sharply. Tell them wait. His eyes finally flicked down. The movement was small, almost casual, but the moment he registered the unfamiliar envelope, its plainness, its deliberate placement, his voice faltered. Maya, what's this? He didn't pick it up at first. He just stared at it, like it was something fragile or dangerous. Give me a minute, he said into the headset, but his tone cracked midway through the sentence. He fumbled for the button to mute the call, then disconnected entirely. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It buzzed with something like foreboding. He reached for the envelope with hands that were suddenly unsteady. What is this, he repeated, softer this time, almost pleading. You should open it, Maya said. Her voice surprised her, quiet but firm, devoid of the tremor she expected. Ethan slid his thumb under the flap, tore it open, and pulled out the divorce papers. The bold header, Petition for Dissolution of Marriage, sat stark and unapologetic across the top page. For a moment, he simply blinked at it, then the color drained from his face. His breath caught. The papers slipped a little in his grip before he tightened his hold, as if afraid they'd vanish if he didn't clutch them tightly enough. He flipped through the pages, scanning quickly, then slower, then not at all. His eyes stalled halfway down the second page, stuck on her signature. Maya. His throat worked around the name as if it hurt to say. What is this? What are you doing? She stood still, hands clasped loosely in front of her. The old version of herself would have rushed in to comfort him, to soften the blow, to say they could talk about it later. But she stayed quiet, giving him the truth she had carried alone for years. "I'm leaving," she said. "I can't keep living like this." He stared at her as though she had just spoken another language. "Leaving Maya? Where just things have been stressful lately. Work's been—" He stopped, losing his words. His mouth opened again, searching, failing. She expected indifference. She expected a shrug, a nod, a weary acceptance as if she were an obligation he'd forgotten to check off his list. But instead, she saw something that startled her fear. Real fear. He sank slowly into his chair, the papers trembling in his hands. "Tell me I'm misunderstanding," he whispered. "Tell me this isn't real. It's real." Her voice held no cruelty, just truth. He looked up, his eyes glossy in a way she hadn't seen since their early years, back when emotion came easily to him. "What did I do?" His voice cracked sharply on the last word. Maya swallowed, for a beat. She almost couldn't speak. She looked at him. Really looked and saw a man who had been so consumed by ambition, he'd forgotten his own home was burning behind him. "You stopped being here," she said simply. "You stopped seeing me." "No, He shook his head, a frantic gesture that didn't match the exhaustion on his face. "I didn't know you were this unhappy. Why didn't we?" He pressed a hand to his forehead, closing his eyes against the weight of it all. God. Maya. Divorce. She nodded once. Ethan's breath came out unsteady. The papers rustled as he set them on the desk, his fingers lingering over her signature like it might explain something he'd missed. His chest rose and fell too quickly, like a man trying not to drown. Maya braced herself for anger, or defensiveness, or bargaining. Instead, he whispered again, barely audible. What did I do? The question hung between them, fragile and devastating. She felt her throat tighten. She wanted to tell him everything, the loneliness, the nights waiting, the years of loving him in silence while he disappeared behind deadlines and ambition. But the words gathered in her chest, too many, too heavy, waiting for the right moment to break free. For now, she just stood there, watching him unravel, wondering if the damage could ever be undone. And somewhere in the quiet of that dim office, a single question rose like smoke, curling into the air. Could a man fix what he never noticed breaking? He asked for one day. She almost said no. The words had fallen out of Ethan's mouth like a plea he hadn't rehearsed, raw and stumbling. Maya had stood frozen in the doorway of his office, the divorce papers still lying on the desk between them, glowing under the late afternoon light like a wound neither of them knew how to cover. One day, he repeated, his voice cracking as if he feared she might disappear if he blinked. Please, Maya, just one day to show you I can be the man you married. She wanted to refuse. The instinct rose sharp and immediate self-protection honed over years of disappointment. But there was something in his eyes she hadn't seen in a very long time. Not charm, not excuses. Something smaller, more human. Fear. And beneath it, a trembling sincerity that felt almost unfamiliar on his face. One day, she said finally. The words were soft, reluctant, but real. That's all. Ethan let out a breath like he'd been holding it for months. He nodded too quickly, as if afraid she'd take it back. Thank you, he whispered. I promise you won't regret it. She didn't answer. Promises were cheap. Actions weren't. The next morning, Maya woke to the smell of something burning. She sat up slowly, disoriented. The other side of the bed was empty. Ethan had gotten up before her. That alone felt strange. When she stepped into the hallway, a cloud of faint gray smoke drifted from the kitchen, and she almost laughed not out of amusement, but a bewildered ache tugging at her ribs. She found Ethan at the stove, waving a dish towel at the smoke detector, which was flashing angrily but mercifully silent for now. The skillet on the burner was splattered with batter, half of which clung stubbornly to the surface in a dark, charred mass. A plate sat on the counter nearby, piled high with what looked like several failed attempts at pancakes, some too pale, others nearly black. When he saw her, Ethan straightened, his expression lighting up with a mixture of embarrassment and hope. "I made breakfast," he said, though it sounded more like a question. She looked at the scene flour dusted across the counter like snowfall, eggshells scattered near the sink, the ruined pancakes wobbling precariously, and felt her heart twist. "You've never made breakfast," she said gently. "I know." He rubbed the back of his neck, cheeks flushing. "I should've. I wanted to try." He handed her a plate, one pancake slightly less mangled than the rest. She sat at the island and took a cautious bite. It wasn't good, but it wasn't awful either. Ethan watched her like a man awaiting a verdict that might determine the rest of his life. "It's not terrible," she said. He exhaled with a laugh, small, nervous, but real. "I'll take not terrible." She caught the sound of his laugh, soft and uncertain, and something in her chest shifted, not mended, just shifted, a reminder of the man he used to be, the man she had once trusted with every version of herself. As she ate, Ethan busied himself cleaning the mess he'd made. It wasn't graceful. He knocked over the container of flour, spilled the spoon into the sink, and got batter on his shirt. But he kept going, clumsy yet determined. And Maya found herself fighting two instincts at once: the instinct to shut down, to keep the walls she'd built intact, and the instinct to hope. Hope was dangerous. Hope had hurt her before. "Can we do something today?" he asked once the kitchen looked somewhat back to normal. "Just something that feels like us?" She hesitated. Like what? He wiped his hands on a towel, suddenly shy in a way she'd forgotten he could be. "Do you remember Riverside Park?" The name landed gently, like a soft echo from a different life. Riverside Park, the place where they'd had their third date. They'd talked for hours under an old oak tree, eating sandwiches from a food truck and laughing until their cheeks hurt. She'd fallen in love with him that day, in that simple patch of Oregon green, with leaves rustling overhead and sunlight flickering through branches. "Yes," she said quietly. "I thought maybe we could go back," he said. "If you're willing." The suggestion hung between them, fragile as a glass ornament. Nostalgia could be a balm or a blade. She wasn't sure which one it would be. "We don't have to," he added quickly. "It's just, when I think about us, the best parts of us, that's the day that comes back to me." She looked at him, then not the man who missed dinners and forgot anniversaries, but the man standing in a messy kitchen with flour on his sleeves and hope trembling in his eyes. A man trying, maybe for the first time in years, to reach for her rather than his work. "Okay," she murmured. "We can go." Ethan's shoulders sagged with visible relief. He nodded, almost cautiously, as if still afraid she might retreat. They spent the next hour getting ready, moving around each other with a strange combination of awkwardness and familiarity. Every glance felt weighted. Every silence felt like a bridge they might or might not cross. When they finally stepped out into the cool morning air, Maya paused on the threshold, her hand lingering on the doorframe. The day stretched ahead of them, filled with possibilities she wasn't sure she trusted. She wasn't sure nostalgia could repair what had broken. She wasn't sure one day could change the shape of years. But as she followed Ethan toward the car, she wondered quietly, cautiously, if maybe, just maybe, something small could begin in the space of 24 hours. If memory was enough to spark something real again. Some truths only came out in the shade of an old tree. The moment Maya stepped onto the grass at Riverside Park, memories moved through her like a soft tide. The oak tree stood exactly where it always had, its wide branches stretching over the hill, filtering sunlight into soft, shifting patterns. She remembered sitting under it years ago, her head on Ethan's shoulder, thinking life couldn't possibly get sweeter. Now she approached the same spot with slow, careful steps, as if walking through the ruins of some place holy. Ethan spread a blanket beneath the tree, a simple plaid one they kept in the trunk for road trips back, when road trips were still a ritual. He smoothed it out with nervous hands, his movements too quick, too deliberate. The air hummed with late morning warmth, but Maya still felt a chill settle around her ribs. "Here," Ethan said, gently offering her a cup of coffee from her favorite bakery. The one she thought he'd forgotten existed. She accepted it, but didn't drink. They sat with a small, polite space between them, not touching, not speaking, just breathing in the same quiet. For a moment, Maya simply watched her hands. The sunlight filtered through the leaves above, dappling her fingers with shifting flecks of gold. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear but from the weight of everything she had carried alone. Ethan noticed. "Maya," he murmured, voice tight, "we can talk about anything. I'm listening." She wanted to doubt him. She wanted to assume this was temporary panic, an instinct to grab what he feared losing. But his eyes held a vulnerability she hadn't seen in years, raw, unprotected, almost boyish in its sincerity. So she inhaled slowly, and the truth began to rise. "You forgot our first anniversary," she said softly, keeping her gaze on the distant tree line. "And the second, and the third." Ethan's breath hitched, subtle but real. She continued, her voice steady but weighted. "I spent those nights alone, sitting on the couch in a dress I bought just for you. I kept telling myself you'd walk through the door any minute." Her throat tightened. "You didn't." A gust of wind rustled the leaves overhead. The sunlight flickered across her lap, as if echoing the trembling in her chest. "I told myself you were busy," she went on, "that it wasn't personal, that you weren't choosing work over me, you just didn't realize you were choosing it all." "Maya," Ethan whispered, but she lifted a hand, not stopping him harshly, just asking for space to finish. "I waited for you. For years, I waited at windows, at restaurant tables, at home with dinner going cold." She swallowed. "I learned how to eat alone without crying. Eventually," Ethan pressed his fingertips to his forehead, eyes glistening. "I didn't know," he said hoarsely. "I swear I didn't know you felt that alone. That's the problem." Her voice broke, just slightly. "You didn't know. You didn't notice. Not even when I tried to tell you." She described the night she got food poisoning and spent 12 miserable hours curled up on the bathroom floor while he was at a product launch. Unreachable. She described the birthday he missed, how he'd sent flowers through his assistant. The wrong kind. Lilies she was allergic to. She described trying to bring up starting a family, only to realize halfway through the conversation that he hadn't heard a single word. Ethan listened, really listened. His chest rose and fell with uneven breaths, and tears slipped down his cheeks one by one, silent and unhidden. "Maya," he said, voice cracking, "I'm so sorry. God, I had no idea I was hurting you like that." A long silence settled between them, heavy but strangely gentle. Maya stared at the leaves swaying above her, remembering how they'd framed Ethan's smile years ago. Everything felt both familiar and unbearably changed. "I miss her," she whispered. "Who?" His voice was soft, broken. "The woman I used to be." Her eyes lowered to her hands again. "The one who laughed without thinking. The one who believed love was enough. The one who trusted you, wouldn't leave her behind." Ethan shifted closer, not touching her, just near enough that she could feel the tremor in his breath. "I never meant to leave you behind," he said. I thought you'd always be there. No matter what." There it was, the confession she didn't expect to hear. The naive certainty of a man who believed constancy required no tending. The wound she'd carried alone now spoken into the open air. Maya's heart clenched, not with anger, not even with relief, something more complicated, something heavier. Because now she had to ask herself the question she'd been avoiding all along. Could love survive being taken for granted? The breeze cooled, and a few leaves drifted down between them like quiet punctuation. She looked at Ethan, at the remorse in his eyes, the boyish fear, the man she'd both loved and lost while he was still beside her. And she didn't yet know the answer. Change was fragile, especially when old habits knew the way home. Maya felt that truth settle in her chest the moment Ethan's phone buzzed for the 4th time in less than 2 minutes. They were sitting at a small patio cafe downtown, a quiet place shaded by broad umbrellas, the kind of spot they used to choose on lazy Saturday afternoons. For 2 weeks, things had been better, not perfect, not healed, but softer. Ethan cleared his schedule more often. They talked without rushing. They walked after dinner, sometimes holding hands, sometimes just sharing the silence. And though she didn't say it out loud, Maya felt the faintest thread of trust weaving itself back into her, thin but present. But now, as the phone rattled on the table between them, vibrating insistently, like a small living thing demanding attention, she felt that thread tighten. Ethan glanced at it once, then again. His shoulders stiffened. His eyes narrowed in that familiar way, the look he always had right before slipping back into the world that had swallowed him whole for years. Work mode, the version of him that didn't see her, didn't see anything except the next crisis. "It's fine," Maya said quietly, even though her stomach was already sinking. "You can check it." He shook his head. "No, I told you today was ours." The phone buzzed again, harder this time, rattling against the wood. A passing waiter shot them a quick, sympathetic look. Maya forced a small smile, pretending she wasn't counting each vibration like it was chipping away at her resolve. Ethan reached forward and flipped the phone face down, covering it with his palm as though he could smother the urgency. "They'll survive without me," he said, but his voice had changed barely, but enough. She knew that tone, half in the moment, half already slipping away. She studied his face, the faint tension around his jaw, the way his fingers drummed unconsciously against the phone. Small signals. Old signals. This was how it always started. He tried to continue their conversation, something about maybe taking a weekend trip soon, somewhere near the coast, but the phone buzzed again, and his sentence trailed off mid-word. Maya didn't speak, didn't move. She simply watched the shift unfold, the competition between intention and habit, and she knew habit was winning. The server brought their food, setting the plates down gently. Ethan thanked him, but didn't look away from the phone beneath his hand. A call came in again, and the phone vibrated so aggressively that his water glass trembled beside it. Maya felt dread pool low in her stomach. 2 weeks. 2 weeks of trying. 2 weeks of seeing him show up for her. For them. And now, in the course of 10 minutes, she felt the past assembling itself brick by brick around them again. It might be an emergency, she said, keeping her voice neutral, a kindness she wasn't sure he deserved. Ethan shook his head, slow and stubborn. "What's an emergency is us." But his voice sounded strained, divided. She could almost see the war behind his eyes. Then the phone rang again, this time a call, not just a message. The screen lit up bright beneath his hand, illuminating the edge of his palm. Ethan closed his eyes, jaw tight. Maya looked at him carefully, not with anger, not even with disappointment, with recognition. She had lived this moment too many times, the tug of war between what mattered and what screamed the loudest, and she knew exactly how it ended. "You can answer it," she said softly. He hesitated, and she saw his throat work as he forced down something: guilt. Maybe regret. Maybe it might be nothing, he said weakly, or it might be something. She replied. The phone rang again, louder this time, and that was it. Something flickered in his expression, an old reflex, and Maya knew the choice had already been made. Ethan exhaled sharply, pulled his hand back, and picked up the phone. "Ethan Carter," he said, his voice snapping instantly into professional clarity. The shift was immediate, unmistakable. His posture changed, his tone sharpened. The person she had married, a man once warm and endlessly present, seemed to fade as the man she had been losing for years took his place again. Maya stared at her plate, her appetite dissolving. The world around her blurred into muted colors, the clinking of silverware, the murmur of nearby conversations, the faint scent of grilled rosemary chicken. Everything continued exactly as it had before, except for the tiny, crushing truth settling in her chest. Old habits always found their way home. Ethan nodded rapidly as he listened, scribbling something on a napkin. "Okay. Yes. I'll look at the numbers. No, I told you I'm. He paused, glancing at Maya briefly, so briefly it could have been an accident, then looked away. I can step away for a moment. Hold on. He stood, turning slightly from the table, voice lowering as he paced a few steps into the courtyard. Maya watched him, her heart quiet, not racing, not aching, just quiet. The kind of quiet that came right before something inside her closed for good. She had once believed that love was a matter of holding on through storms. But now, watching him walk away, phone pressed tight to his ear, she wondered whether this was simply who he was, and whether hoping otherwise was the mistake she kept repeating. She folded her napkin, smoothing it carefully across her lap. 2 weeks, 2 weeks of good days, 2 weeks of trying, but 2 weeks couldn't rewrite years. A shadow passed over their table as a cloud drifted in front of the sun. The light dimmed softly, like a curtain lowering over a stage, across the courtyard. Ethan stopped pacing. He lowered the phone, staring at it, then turned slowly back toward her. But Maya didn't smile, didn't reassure him. She simply met his gaze, her own steady, unreadable, and he seemed to understand too late that something fragile had cracked again. He walked back to the table and opened his mouth as if to speak, but she wasn't sure she wanted to hear it. Not yet. Maybe not ever. A man was defined by what he chose when everything was on the line. Those words drifted through Maya's mind as she stood in the quiet bedroom, suitcase open on the bed, her hands moving with a steadiness that surprised her. Outside the door, she could hear Ethan's voice low, tense, clipped, the kind of voice he only used when something enormous was at stake. The call had followed them home like a shadow, insistent and impossible to ignore. She didn't know the details. She didn't need to. The tone alone had told her everything. This wasn't just work. This was opportunity. The kind of opportunity people built their entire lives around. The kind of opportunity Ethan had once considered worth missing dinners, anniversaries, and pieces of his marriage. The suitcase zipper glided smoothly as she opened the front pocket. It felt familiar, the motion, the resignation. She'd packed in her mind a dozen times in the past years, but now her hands were doing what her heart had never let her finish. She paused, fingers resting on the handle of a folded sweater. Listening, his voice carried faintly down the hallway. I understand what this deal means. I do. A long silence. Then, just give me a second. A second, just like so many before. Maya exhaled slowly, the air trembling out of her. She lifted another piece of clothing and laid it neatly inside. The sun outside dipped lower, casting long stripes of soft gold across the bedroom floor. It should have been beautiful. Instead, it only made her chest ache. This was supposed to be their new beginning. 2 weeks of effort. 2 weeks of something resembling tenderness again. And yet, here they were, standing at the crossroads she had always dreaded. She folded a pair of jeans, then a blouse. Her movements were gentle, almost ritualistic. Leaving wasn't a slam of a door. It was this quiet, careful packing, the closing of a chapter through the steady work of her hands. For a moment she stopped and sat on the edge of the bed, palms pressed against the cool fabric of the suitcase. She looked around the room, the framed photo on the dresser, the lamp they picked together before the wedding, the quilt she'd spent months sewing during their early years. Everything felt deeply familiar, yet painfully far away. Her eyes stung. From the hallway came Ethan's voice, again sharper, this time angry. No, listen, I said. He stopped suddenly. Another silence followed, heavier than the first. Then the click of the call ending. Maya didn't move. She didn't trust herself to. 20 minutes had passed since he answered the phone. 20 minutes of her packing. 20 minutes of bracing for the moment she walked out the door for good. When footsteps finally approached, her breath caught. The doorway filled with Ethan's silhouette, his shoulders slumped as though carrying a weight too heavy to name. He didn't speak right away. He stood there for several seconds, chest rising unevenly, eyes traveling from the suitcase to her, Maya, he said at last, voice raw. I told them no. She blinked, unsure she'd heard him correctly. What I said no, he repeated, stepping into the room. His hands were shaking. To the deal, the expansion, all of it. Her heartbeat thudded in her ears. Ethan, that opportunity, I know what it is, he said quietly. But I know what this is too. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and without hesitation turned it off. Then he crossed the room, opened the nightstand drawer, and placed the phone inside. The gesture was deliberate, final, as if he were setting down a weapon. Maya stared, stunned. She had begged for moments like this once, moments when he would choose her without negotiation, without calculation. But now that it was happening, the shock of it washed over her in a strange, dizzying wave. I can't lose you, Ethan said, voice trembling. Not again. Not because I was too blind to understand that love isn't guaranteed. She watched him, unsure whether to step closer or step away. There were tears in his eyes, real ones, not the polished remorse he sometimes offered after arguments in the past. This was different. There was fear in him, fear of the consequences, fear of her silence. You're worth more than everything I've built, he said softly. Her breath shuddered. The sincerity in his tone was almost painful, but sincerity didn't erase years. Ethan, she swallowed hard. I don't know if this changes anything. He nodded slowly. I know, and I'm not asking you to believe me right away. I need you to know that I'm here, that I'm choosing us, even if it terrifies me. She lowered her gaze, her fingers brushing the edge of the suitcase. Part of her wanted to cry in relief, in grief, in confusion. Another part of her wanted to scream that it shouldn't take losing someone to finally see them. And beneath it all, something tender flickered, hope or something close to it, trying to rise despite all the reasons she'd buried it. She stood slowly, unsure of what she was about to say. The air between them felt fragile, thick with everything unspoken. I need time, she whispered. I'll give you all the time you need, he said. She searched his face for hesitation, for the familiar impatience. But there was none, only fear, and something steady beneath it. Maybe this was real, maybe it wasn't. Maybe choosing her once didn't mean he'd choose her again. As the sun dipped fully behind the trees outside, and the room settled into a soft, quiet glow, she took a small step toward him, uncertain, almost invisible. He didn't move. He didn't reach for her. He simply waited. And she wasn't sure yet whether that patience was enough. Rebuilding wasn't romantic. It was work the kind that didn't make headlines or fit into a neat story, the kind that asked for patience even on days when patience felt thin. Maya realized that the first morning she and Ethan drove together to their new couples therapist. The sky was overcast, a soft Portland gray, and the windows of the car fogged around the edges from their quiet breathing. They didn't talk much. Words felt fragile, as if too many of them might break the little progress they'd made. Still, something about the shared silence felt different from the months before. Less empty, more deliberate. The therapy office was warm, filled with muted colors and the faint scent of eucalyptus. Maya sat on the couch, hands clasped tightly in her lap, while Ethan leaned forward with both elbows on his knees, as if bracing for impact. The therapist, a middle-aged woman with silver-streaked hair and kind eyes, invited them to talk about the past week. Ethan went first, something that shocked Maya a little. I struggled on Wednesday, he admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. There was a server meltdown at work, the kind that usually means I stay until midnight. Maya remembered that day how tense he'd looked at dinner, how he'd kept glancing at the phone in the drawer. But I stayed home, he said. I kept thinking about what choosing work over her has cost me. The therapist nodded gently. And how did that feel? Like I was learning to breathe differently. Ethan answered, uncomfortable, but necessary. Maya watched him carefully. He wasn't putting on a performance. His voice had that rough honesty she remembered from their early years. When it was her turn, She spoke quietly. I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop. She said, every time his phone buzzed, every time he hesitated, I braced myself to lose everything again. The room fell soft. There was no judgment from the therapist, just understanding. And maybe that was why Maya felt her shoulders loosen, just a little. The session didn't end with breakthroughs or tears. Just small truths laid gently on the table, truths that felt like stepping stones across a river they'd nearly drowned in. Over the next few weeks, life found a new shape. Maya returned to work, taking a part-time position with an events company she used to admire. The first morning, she packed her tote bag and headed for the door. Ethan stood in the kitchen holding a mug of coffee he'd made for her too strong, a little burnt, but made with intention. You'll do great, he told her. It wasn't the kind of grand speech he might have made years ago. It was simple, grounded, real. Her first day back. She felt like she'd stepped into sunlight after years indoors. She loved the chatter of coworkers, the rush of planning, the small victories of solving problems on the fly. She came home tired, but fulfilled, and Ethan greeted her with 2 warm mugs set on the kitchen island. One for him, one for her. It felt symbolic, 2 lives, not one orbiting the other, but the balance was delicate. Some nights, fear crept in like a draft under the door. Maya would catch Ethan typing an email on the couch after dinner and feel her chest tighten. Not because he was doing anything wrong, but because she'd lived too long in the shadow of his ambition. Other nights. Ethan watched her sorting through event proposals, his expression shifting almost imperceptibly. Admiration tangled with insecurity. They both sensed it, the quiet worry that their healing might not hold. One evening, they cooked together, Ethan chopping vegetables slowly, still learning, still trying, while Maya stirred a pot of sauce. Music played softly in the background, and for a moment she felt something she hadn't in a long time, contentment. A fragile kind, but real. Midway through dinner, her phone buzzed with an email notification. She almost ignored it, but glanced anyway and froze. A job offer, a real one, full-time, leadership role, better pay than she'd ever earned. It wasn't in her plan, but her chest fluttered with excitement, a spark she hadn't felt in years. She set her fork down. Ethan noticed immediately. What's wrong? Nothing, she said, though her voice shook ever so slightly. I just got an offer. He went still. What kind of offer? She turned the screen toward him. He read the subject line, and she saw the shift in his eyes, the hint of fear, the flicker of something he hadn't learned to name yet. For so long, her world had been built around his. Now hers was growing its own branches, its own sun. He swallowed, the movement tight, almost strained. That's huge. She nodded. Yeah, it is. Silence swelled between them, not hostile, but tense. It felt like standing at the beginning of a new path, one that demanded equality, compromise, and the courage to keep choosing each other, even as their lives expanded in different directions. Do you want it? He asked quietly. Maya hesitated. Want was complicated. Want meant change. Want meant no more waiting at home. Want meant she wouldn't always be the person who could bend. She lifted her eyes. I think so. Ethan exhaled, the sound uneven, and she couldn't tell if his expression held pride or fear that he might not know how to love a woman who no longer needed permission to have her own life. She didn't press him, she didn't soothe, she just watched him sit with the truth. Outside, night pressed against the windows. Inside, their 2 warm mugs sat cooling on the island symbols of connection, now sitting just a few inches apart, and Maya wondered, with a flutter of both hope and uncertainty, whether their marriage was strong enough to hold 2 full hearts instead of one half-dimmed one. For the first time in years, Maya woke before her alarm, not out of anxiety, but out of something gentler, a quiet thrill, the kind she used to feel in her 20s, when a new job meant possibility instead of pressure. Dawn stretched across Portland in pale gold, brushing the skyline and spilling into their bedroom through the sheer curtains. She sat on the edge of the bed, letting her feet touch the floor with a sense of grounding she hadn't felt in a long time. Behind her, Ethan still slept lightly, his breathing soft and steady. There had been nights too many when she'd lain awake beside him and felt miles away. Now the distance wasn't gone, but it wasn't suffocating either. It felt more like a bridge being rebuilt, plank by careful plank. She dressed quietly, choosing a navy blouse she hadn't worn in years. It had always made her feel capable, confident. As she buttoned the cuffs, she caught her reflection in the mirror and paused. Her posture looked different, straighter, less apologetic. She smiled a little. Driving to work, she let the radio play old songs she used to love. The streets shimmered with early light, shop windows still dark, the world just beginning to wake. When she pulled into the parking lot of her new office, she didn't sit in the car to gather courage. She stepped out with her shoulders back, breathing in the crisp morning air. Inside, her team welcomed her warmly. There were mood boards to review, upcoming events to plan, clients to email. She moved through it all with a focus she'd forgotten she had. Her hands steadied naturally over the planner, her voice clear during meetings. At one point, someone asked for her opinion on a design direction, and she realized how good it felt to be valued for her ideas, not just her presence. By lunchtime, she felt lighter, energized. When she slid into her car at the end of the day, a satisfied ache settled in her muscles, a good ache the kind that came from purpose. That evening, she found Ethan chopping vegetables in the kitchen, a towel slung over his shoulder like he'd been practicing. The knife was too big for the job, and he held it awkwardly, but he looked up with a grin that creased the corners of his eyes. "How was your day?" he asked. She set her bag down, letting the warmth of his attention settle over her. "Busy. Good busy." He nodded, genuine pride flickering across his face, but behind it, something else. A quiet tension, a shadow of fear. She could almost hear his thoughts. What if she grows without me? What if she goes so far I can't keep up? She didn't call it out. She wasn't sure she could comfort him without dimming her own light. Their evenings found a new rhythm. Separate commutes, separate stories, shared dinners. Some nights they talked easily, other nights felt more careful, as if they were learning each other's edges again. Yet the balance felt healthier than anything they had had in years. Ethan changed too slowly, imperfectly. He delegated more at work, trusting his team even when it made him twitch with old habits. He set clearer hours. He apologized more readily. He closed his laptop early, sometimes with a heavy sigh, sometimes with determination. Maya noticed how he'd linger in the doorway of her home office, as if needing reassurance that she still wanted him near. One morning, as she stepped into her workplace just after sunrise, the sky streaked with pink and lavender behind her. The moment hit her with unexpected force. She felt like a woman stepping into her own story. Not supporting cast, not afterthought, not the silent half of a marriage, just herself, strong, capable, alive. That evening, she returned home to find a small wrapped package sitting on the kitchen island. Ethan stood nearby, hands in his pockets, shifting his weight like a man unsure whether he'd crossed a line. She raised an eyebrow. "What's this? Just open it," he said. She peeled back the paper slowly. Inside was a framed photo of the two of them, from their early years, standing barefoot in the backyard of their first rental home, laughing under string lights, faces flushed with joy and wine and simpler times. She remembered that night. She remembered how free she'd felt then, how certain they were that they'd always choose each other. Her throat tightened. "Where did you find this back of my closet?" he said. "I didn't want to lose it again." She traced the edge of the frame, the wood warm against her fingers. The gesture was small, thoughtful, and undeniably earnest, but it also stirred a bittersweet ache, a reminder of how far they'd drifted, a question of whether sentiment could hold two changing lives together. She met Ethan's eyes. He looked hopeful, but fragile not with weakness, but with the fear of a man trying very hard not to repeat the worst parts of himself. "Do you like it?" he asked. She softened. "I do." They stood there, silent for a long moment. the photo between them like a bridge to a former version of their love. Later that night, after he'd gone to bed, Maya stayed in the living room, turning the frame in her hands. The memory inside it was beautiful, but so far behind them. She wondered if they were building something new, or trying to stitch together pieces of something already broken. She set the photo down slowly, letting her fingers rest on the glass. A question rose quietly in her chest, heavy but honest. Were they truly rebuilding or just patching? It happened on an ordinary Tuesday, the kind that slipped by without making demands. Maya had come home later than usual, her shoulders sore from a long meeting, her hair pulled back messily after a day of running from one task to another. Ethan was in the kitchen, stirring a pot of soup, something simple, something he'd learned to make because it made her feel cared for. "Long day?" he asked, without turning, though she could hear the smile in his voice. "Endless," she murmured, dropping her purse by the entryway. "I think I spent more time talking in circles than planning anything." He chuckled softly. "That's what soup is for." She leaned her hip against the counter, watching him taste the broth, watching the way he concentrated as if the smallest detail mattered. Sometimes she forgot that this man, this gentle, trying, present version of him, was the same person who had once lived on his phone and left her drowning in silence. Now he moved slower, listened more, remembered things she said. It wasn't perfection, it was effort. And in her 30s, effort meant more than grand promises ever had. Dinner was quiet and comfortable. They talked about nothing in particular. A co-worker of hers with a dramatic flair. A server glitch at his company that his team solved without him stepping in. They cleaned up side by side, hands brushing occasionally, each touch warm but easy, like a language only they understood. Later, when Maya sank into bed, a wave of exhaustion pushed through her. Not the kind that came from work. This was heavier, deeper. She lay still, watching the ceiling. A thought flickered, then returned with steady persistence. 3 minutes later, she sat up slowly. In the bathroom, the soft hum of the overhead fan filled the quiet as she reached into the cabinet for a small box she hadn't touched in nearly 2 years. She held it in her palm for a while, feeling her heartbeat rise. When the pink lines appeared, bold and unmoving, she covered her mouth with both hands. A tremor passed through her, not fear exactly, but a stunned, fragile joy. Ethan found her sitting on the closed toilet lid, holding the test like an artifact. Maya. His voice was careful, almost afraid to break whatever moment he'd walked into. She looked up, breath unsteady. "Ethan, I'm pregnant." For a second he didn't move, didn't blink, just stared as if the world had tilted without warning. Then he took a shaky step forward, one hand reaching for hers, the other touching the test as though confirming it was real. "Are you sure?" he whispered. She nodded, and something in him unraveled. He knelt on the tile floor, resting his forehead gently against her abdomen, his breath warm through her shirt. His hands came to rest there, tentative at first, then gathering confidence, as if holding something precious he didn't yet know how to protect. "Maya," he murmured, his voice breaking in the middle. We're going to have a baby." The awe in his voice washed over her, and she felt an ache she hadn't expected, an ache of gratitude, of relief, of fear, of possibility. She placed her hands over his, their fingers overlapping on her belly. The weight of them together felt grounding, as if this tiny new beginning anchored them both. He looked up at her, eyes damp, expression raw. "I never thought we'd get here," he admitted. "I almost threw everything away." "So did I," she whispered. They sat like that for a while on the bathroom floor, wrapped in a silence so gentle it felt holy. When they finally moved to the bedroom, Ethan pulled her close, his hand never leaving her stomach, as if reassurance flowed through touch. That night, they lay awake longer than usual. The lamp cast a soft glow across the comforter as they talked in low voices, the way people do when dreaming out loud. "What if I mess this up?" Ethan asked quietly. "Parenting. It scares me more than any deal, any boardroom." She traced a line down his arm. Thoughtful. It scares me too. I didn't have much to look up to, he confessed. My dad, he wasn't around much. She nodded. She knew the stories not detailed, but enough to understand the shadow they cast. I just want to be better than what I had, he said. Better than who I used to be. You already are, she told him gently. And she meant it. Maya hesitated then, feeling her own vulnerability rising. What if I grow into motherhood, into work, and you feel left behind? What if we lose each other again? He cupped her cheek. Then we talk. We fight for it. We refuse to drift. There was no bravado in his voice, no sweeping declarations. Just quiet certainty, the kind built from surviving something that nearly destroyed them. Hours slipped by like that, soft words, shared hopes, whispered fears. At one point, Ethan rested his hand on her belly again, warm and steady. I promise, he said gently. I'm here, really here, for you, for this little one, for us. She covered his hand with hers, feeling the steady rhythm of his pulse, the promise beneath it. Outside, the city hummed its late-night sounds, a distant siren, a car passing, the world continuing as it always had. But inside their bedroom, everything felt different, like they were standing at the doorway of the life they had almost lost, and finally choosing to walk into it together. Still, as she drifted towards sleep, one question whispered through her mind, soft but earnest. How would they honor a second chance so fragile, so precious, and so nearly gone? A decade later, the oak tree looked almost exactly the same: broad branches, generous shade, leaves whispering in the late afternoon breeze, but everything else had changed. Maya stood at its base, one hand gently smoothing the collar of her son's shirt, the other brushing a stray leaf from her hair. The boy, 3 years old, curious, restless, kept tugging at her fingers, trying to chase a squirrel darting around the roots. Just a minute, sweetheart, she murmured, her voice soft with the kind of patience she used to think only other people possessed. Ethan walked toward them from the picnic table they had set up earlier, carrying a small cloth pouch in his hands. His hair was grayer now, cut shorter, and the lines around his eyes had deepened, but they had softened too, reshaped by years of choosing presence over achievement. He paused halfway to watch them, Maya bending to fix their son's shoelace, sunlight warming the side of her face, her small smile as she whispered something that made the boy giggle. For a moment, he simply absorbed it. 10 years of work, repair, forgiveness, and choosing each other in ways neither of them knew how to do the first time around. Maya saw him watching and gave a quiet, knowing smile. Ready. He nodded, though something in him trembled. Yeah, ready. They walked together toward the tree, a little ceremony, as small and intimate as a secret. No guests, no decorations, no officiant. Just the three of them and the place where everything had almost fallen apart. Ethan set the pouch at the base of the trunk, then took her hands. It's strange, he said, his voice low. Standing here again. She squeezed his fingers gently. Strange. And right. The boy wandered nearby, picking up acorns and handing them to Maya as if offering gifts. She accepted each one with quiet amusement, letting them rest in her palm until he ran off again. Ethan took a breath that felt heavier than the air around them. I've been thinking about that day, he said, the first time we sat under this tree. All the things you said, all the things I didn't hear. Maya looked down at their joined hands, sunlight shifting across them like a blessing. We were different people then. I was afraid, he admitted. Afraid of failing, afraid of slowing down, afraid that if I stopped chasing everything, I'd lose what I'd built. She nodded, and I was afraid of disappearing. His grip tightened, not painfully, just enough that she felt the steadiness in him, the kind he'd learned slowly, painfully, year by year. You never disappeared, he said softly. I lost sight. That's not the same. She didn't respond at first. The breeze rustled the leaves above them, and the shadows swayed gently across their shoes. The boy toddled back with a stick he found, showing it proudly before running off again. The sight made something warm unfold inside her chest. When she finally looked up, her eyes held years of tenderness and truth. "We almost didn't make it. I know." His voice cracked, and I carry that with me. Not as shame, just remembrance. A reminder of what I almost lost. She breathed in deeply, letting the moment settle. "So, what promise do you want to make today?" He reached into the pouch, pulling out 2 simple bands, nothing flashy. Just brushed silver warmed by his palm. "Just one," he said, lifting her hand. "I see you. I won't forget again." Her eyes softened, filling with something deep and steady. Not the fiery hope of their early years, not the brittle longing of the hard ones, something gentler, wiser. She lifted his ring next. "And I choose to stay present with you, not out of fear, not out of habit, but because of the life we built, because of who we became." When she slid the ring onto his finger, his breath shook, just slightly. The boy returned again, curious, tugging at Ethan's pant leg as if asking what the ceremony meant. Ethan scooped him up with one arm, holding him against his shoulder, their heads close. Maya touched the back of her son's curls, soft, sun-warmed, smelling faintly of grass. Under the oak tree, the 3 of them stood together, framed by shifting light and the quiet hum of summer. There were no witnesses, no photos, no applause, just a family that had been broken, rebuilt, tested, strengthened. Ethan whispered, almost to himself, "I'm grateful for the life we almost lost, because it taught me how to live the one we have now." Maya leaned her head against his arm. "Me too." The boy wriggled down and ran toward a patch of clover, leaving them standing hand in hand. The air was warm, the shade was soft. The world felt both familiar and new, as the light filtered through the leaves, painting patterns across their joined hands. Maya wondered not with fear now, but with quiet reverence what love becomes after surviving itself. She didn't have the full answer yet, but she knew this. It becomes presence. It becomes choosing again. It becomes the steady warmth of a hand that doesn't let go. Sometimes, healing begins in the quietest places, often when we're convinced we've reached the end of something. Not every breaking point is a failure. Sometimes it's the moment a person finally turns toward the life they were meant to live, whether that's inside a relationship or beyond it. What Maya and Ethan learned is something many grown hearts eventually face. Love doesn't disappear all at once. It fades in the small neglects, the missed moments, the silences that grow heavier than words. And if it is to return, it returns through the same small door's presence, attention, humility, and the courage to begin again. There is no shame in asking for more, no weakness in walking away from what starves the soul, and no story is ever too damaged to choose honesty, care, and a different ending than the one fear predicted. In the end, healing is rarely loud. It often looks like 2 hands finding each other again after years of letting go, or like one person learning to stand tall on their own. Wherever you are on your path, may you feel worthy of being seen, heard, and cherished because you are. Thank you for spending this time with our story. Your presence means more than words can express, reminding us why we share these moments. If this story touched your heart, a like, share, or subscribe helps bring more stories like this into the world, wishing you peace, warmth, and gentle moments of joy in every day.